Поканувам да видиме кратко интервју со американскиот експерт во областа на перење пари. Неговото име е Марк Нанс. Со него разговара колегата Александар Димитриевски, а генерално темата е: можат ли украдените испрани пари во Македонија да бидат најдени и вратени?
Потрагата по украдени или испрани пари од Македонија е тема која што е особено важна во јавноста во Македонија во изминативе неколку години, особено со почетокот на работата на специјалното јавно обвинителство. Колку е навистина тешко да им се влезе во трагата на тие пари и колкави се шансите тие пари да се вратат назад во државата?
I think there are a couple of issues that are probably most important in shaping how difficult it is to trace that money and get it back. One is the independence of the special prosecutor's office. And that is, are they truly independent? Are they able to move freely? Do they have independent funding? Those sorts of questions. The second issue in terms of getting the money back, assuming it can be traced, is relations with if the money's been put offshore. It really requires good relations with the country where the funds are located, because ultimately, assuming that the monies were sent through private channels into the private sector in some form into another country, it ultimately requires another country, let's say if it's the United States or if it's, pick a jurisdiction, Switzerland, then it requires good relations with the Macedonian government and that government, the receiving government, because that receiving government has to carry out a process, its own legal process to freeze those funds and probably also to help identify those funds.
Барем во развиениот свет, колкав процент од парите за кои што ќе се утврди дека се испрани или украдени, се враќаат назад во таа држава?
So ultimately, it's hard to answer that question because we don't know how much money is laundered to begin with, right? So particularly if the question is about a percentage, you really need to know the baseline, and we don't know that. It's sort of inherent in the problem, right? That we don't know how much money is laundered. I think the return of funds and the confiscation of assets is a big push in international standards, and certainly one of the questions around the Macedonian system is how well those rules operate, the way that they've been designed and implemented so far, and I think Macedonia has made some improvements from what I've read on that, so that's good. But the confiscation, the percentage, I think you go after these things not to get the money back so much as to prevent it from happening again. Ultimately. So if that's probably the mindset that needs to be there. I think experience shows that the return of these assets is pretty rare.
Барем во случајот на Македонија се чини дека сериозна отежнителна околност е што голем број на правни субјекти во својата сопстvenичка структура имаат офшор компании. Дали навистина е толку голема отежнителна околност доколку фирмите што работат овде имаат сопственици кои што се наоѓаат на овие офшор дестинации?
I'd say it's huge. It becomes very difficult because again, that means the special prosecutor's office, no matter how independent it is, as I was just saying, is very important. It can be completely independent and have every possible authority available to it domestically, but it has no powers once it leaves Macedonia or any other country for that matter, right? That has a special prosecutor. The question of offshore, that's why offshore companies are so popular. One of the reasons that offshore is so popular for hiding illicit funds, because it makes it quite difficult.
Има ли можности за една земја да донесе такво законодавство со што би ограничило сите фирми кои што сакаат да работат на нејзина територија, да не смеат да имаат офшор компанија во нивната сопстvenичка структура?
I don't know, and I may be wrong about this. I'm not familiar with a country that has banned having offshore companies. In part because offshore, I think, often has some advantages for companies, and they're not necessarily bad. They get a bad reputation, of course, right? And that's probably deserved overall. But there are legitimate reasons, and certainly legal reasons, to have offshore parts of your structure. It can make various financial transactions easier. So I think, to my knowledge, I don't know of any countries that have banned those. The question becomes taxation, transparency, how those are reported, Those are the more important questions, is how you structure the regulation of that and the information that has to come from companies about their investments in offshore.
Вие се залагате за стандардизација на инструментите во борбата против перењето на пари. Зошто сметате дека тоа може да направи еден голем исчекор кон сузбивањето на оваа појава?
So I would change that wording just a little bit, if I can, to away from standardization, because standardization implies usually that everybody has the same rules on the books, right? And I think there's a reason that international standard-setting bodies have moved away from that standard setting to sort of contextualizing the rules more. So I think it's really important that that countries and jurisdictions generally start to move toward a common goal of preventing money laundering. And I think it's useful to have things like the Financial Action Task Force 40 recommendations as a guide. Those are essentially a set of best practices that the international community has developed over time. And so I think those are useful. But I think it remains very important for countries to understand the specific risks that they face. And that's why bodies like FATF and others have moved towards what they call a risk-based approach, which implies understanding the specific challenges that Macedonia faces, because they're different for money laundering. They're different than Switzerland, than the United States, than South Africa, than Belgium. And so, yes, I think there needs to be an international endeavor, because money laundering, because we're talking about offshore, for example, money laundering often is an international action. So there needs to be cooperation, but there still needs to be a sort of contextualization of those rules to the specifics of a country.